something as simple as giving someone permission. Obviously, they have that permission, but when they hear it from someone they're perceiving as like the leader of the class, and then it feels better, it's almost revolutionary in their body. And I think that's an opportunity that we have as teachers to really help our students learn about themselves. And you and I always talk about this, but I love yoga because it helps me learn about myself.
Welcome to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. My name is Reika and I am your host. And if you are a returning listener, welcome back and thank you so much for tuning in again. And if you are a new listener, welcome to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. I started this podcast about a year ago. I wanted to interview full-time yoga teachers across the world to hear their stories and journey of how they have made teaching yoga into their career, and what are some challenges they have to overcome, and what are some lessons they learned along the way, as well as what is the passion behind them for continuing to do what they love as their job. And that's been something I've been really interested in since when I first became a yoga teacher. I went head on first, trying to be a full-time yoga teacher from the moment I graduated from yoga teacher training. And there's been a lot of trials and errors and a lot of stumbling and falling, but getting back up. And I do have full-time yoga teachers in my social circle that I lean on, and we give advices on each other, or we share our experiences to one another. But I wish I had more stories and more people to speak to and learn from when I was a new teacher. So that's kind of why I started this podcast. I wanted to interview full-time yoga teachers from all over the world to see how they have made their own unique career path work for them. So I hope you're enjoying all the episodes I've been releasing every single week. I do have a quick announcement before we get started on this week's episode. So this upcoming weekend, which is March 16th on Sunday, from 11 o'clock in downtown Long Beach, I am hosting a workshop, or event, I would say, for Spring Equinox. This is a Spring Equinox yoga and sound bath event. I am teaming up with my good friend Carlos. He is going to be playing live music during yoga class that I will be teaching, and he's going to give you a nice juicy sound bath at the end. And this is at Alter Society, which is a brewery here in downtown Long Beach. So if you're a listener from Long Beach or near Long Beach, if you want to participate in this event, I invite you to come and join me for a Spring Equinox event. It is from 11 o'clock. It's 75 minutes yoga class and sound bath with live music. And this is part of the 3-part series event that Carlos and I will be hosting once a month at the same location. So this is the first of the 3. We're going to be celebrating Spring Equinox. I'm very, very excited to be celebrating Spring Equinox with all of you. And if you buy all 3 tickets, because it's a 3-part series, we'll be teaching this similar yoga and sound event once a month, March, April, and May. So if you buy 3 tickets, you are going to save money by buying 3 tickets, but you can also buy individually. The events are happening on Sundays once a month from 11 a.m. to 12:15. And if you want to stay at Alter Society afterwards for lunch or coffee or beer, you get 20% off your bill if you attend this workshop. So I hope you can make it. I would love to see you. The last event Carlos and I collaborated with Alter Society went so amazing, and it was such a fun experience, as well as the space that you get to practice yoga in. It's just one of the most beautiful places I have ever taught, and I guarantee you are going to love this experience. If you're planning to come, do bring your yoga mat, and I would even recommend bringing blankets or pillows or maybe socks, sweater, something where you can make yourself really comfortable, especially during Shavasana and sound bath portion of the class. So to sum it up, this Sunday, March 16th at 11 a.m., Carlos and I are teaching an event for Spring Equinox. yoga, and live music. I hope you can make it. I'll put link to purchase this event on the show notes, so you can easily go over there and click on the link to find out more. You can always message me and ask me questions anytime you wish. Okay, enough announcement for now. So I want to talk a little bit about this week's episode. If you remember Karen, I interviewed Karen at the very, very, very beginning of this podcast. She was my first guest on the podcast, and actually her episode has the most listen out of them all. So I know you all like Karen. And if you live in local Long Beach area and you practice yoga, you probably know Karen. She's a very popular and very skilled, experienced, and great teacher. I look up to her and I am happy to call her my colleague. We love talking about yoga, yoga world, anatomy of yoga, body mechanics of yoga. We just love to get really nerdy talking about yoga. So I reached out to her and say, hey, let's have a conversation together for the podcast about yoga. So today's episode is going to be first of next couple episode that's going to be coming out, where Karen and I are having casual conversations about yoga anatomy and cueing. We want to share some of the cues that we used to say that we no longer say anymore. Cues that now we know better to say it in a different way. But it used to be, and maybe it still is, a quite common cue you still hear in the yoga world. So we talk about why we don't use these cues anymore and what are some alternative cues we might choose to use instead. So I hope this conversation is fun and interesting to you. I love hearing feedback. So if you want to give me a feedback on what you thought, if you use this cue or not, or maybe you also have stepped away, or maybe this was the first time you ever heard of anyone debunking this cue. So I'm just so curious. Feel free to let us know with your thoughts and feedback on this. And on this week's conversation, we are talking specifically about shoulders, arms, and hands. So that's kind of the cues we're going to focus on, and next week we'll focus on different part of our body. So I hope you enjoy this casual, fun conversation that Karen and I had together, and I will speak to you on the other side. Thank you, Karen, so much for coming on this week so we can chat about cueing and what are some cues that we have stepped away from saying. Maybe we used to say these cues, but over the years, with more trainings and more we know about our bodies and anatomy, these are the cues that we have kind of evolved from. We don't say it so much anymore, and we have been seeing the shift in the yoga world of people and teachers moving away from using these cues. So we wanted to have this chat and share this conversation on the podcast. So this week, we want to talk a little bit about shoulders and arms. So the first cue is, I still hear these cues a lot, is pull the shoulder blades down the back away from your ears when arms are overhead. For example, down dog or handstand, or even Urdhva Hastasana from mountain pose, reaching the arms overhead. So do you still hear this cue a lot, Karen?
Yeah, I definitely still hear this cue a lot. And I think part of it is, and I get it, because there are definitely words, even for me as a teacher, that I still lean into. Maybe they're things that I heard in my teacher training or when I had been, practicing before. But it's interesting how I almost feel like sometimes it's to fill space as teachers when we're not really sure what to say, or we feel like we need to give our students something to think about. We fall back on those cues. And I think for most teachers, it's something that we heard in our own teacher training. Yeah. I still hear it.
We hear it so much still. And it's one of those cues that when I break it down, whenever I'm teaching a teacher training or continuing education thing or anatomy or in my mentorship group, people are still surprised every time I bring it up that we don't need to say that anymore. And I talk about the reason why and anatomy behind it. And I think because of the type of people I follow on social media, I see many teachers speaking up about this, that we don't need to say pull the shoulder blades down when the arms are overhead. In the teaching setting, this is a question most students I teach this to are like jaw dropping. Like they're so surprised to hear that. So I know it's still out there.
Yeah, and I think, all these cues, I don't think that they come from a place of, I think we can all maybe as teachers start to micromanage people, even myself included. But I think a cue in particular, like this one where it's pull your shoulder blades down your back, or relax your shoulder blades down your back when your arms are overhead in particular, comes from a place of perhaps not wanting people to create so much tension in their traps. And I think that that's valid, right? Because I think, we're texting on our phones, we're driving, we're hunched, we're flexed over. Even for myself, like when I get stressed, my shoulders draw up into my ears. So I don't necessarily think that the cue itself is wrong. But I think, like you're saying, it depends on what's happening, the action of the arms. And the thing is that when you are taking your arms overhead or moving into shoulder flexion, your shoulder blades physically lift as your arms lift, which means that your shoulders are going to move up. So, we're concerned about people's shoulders going up into their ears, but your shoulders will lift up when your arms lift overhead.
So when we ask students to pull the shoulder blades down the back, away from your ears when the arms are overhead, it's almost we're asking the body to do something that is like innately unnatural, because naturally the shoulder blades have this upward rotation and reaches up. Shoulder blades does move back up, but also there's a rotation upward that happens when arms go overhead. And after that, we ask the student to pull the shoulders down the back. It's almost like body gets confused of like, oh, wait, which one am I supposed to do? And you can kind of feel it too.
Yeah, and it has a name. It's not, it's, and this was one for me too. I used to say this all the time when I was a brand new teacher, all the time, anytime the arms are overhead. But it's called scapular-humeral rhythm, or I've also heard it called glenohumeral rhythm. But it's a rhythm in which when the arms lift, the shoulder blades lift up, but technically the inner border tips in, the outer part of the shoulder blade lifts up. So the bottom tips of the shoulder blades kind of lift and almost widen around your ribs. So I guess technically, and it's interesting because I was thinking about this before we started talking, the inner border of the shoulder blade kind of tips down, right? But this shoulder blade's still lifting. So this is where sometimes, and this is where it's hard as a teacher, because if you over-explain, you'll lose a lot of people in a group class, right?
Wow. Oh my God. And it's so true what you said, because I have heard Annie, my teacher, Annie Carpenter, will say sometime, inner border of shoulder blades down, the outer border lift and like reaches up towards your pinky fingers or something like that. So if you want to get technical, you can say inner borders down and outer border up. But for most people in your yoga class, they're not going to get that, or, they're not going to be in the headspace to think about the inner border versus the outer border and bottom tips of the shoulder blades. So what do you say? Do you say anything when you are teaching arms overhead poses?
Honestly, I personally feel like I actually encourage people to reach up more and let the shoulders lift more, only because I feel like it has been drilled in so much to people who've been practicing yoga for a while to pull their shoulders down. So I usually will tell them to reach up, let their shoulders, I'll sometimes say, let your shoulder blades lift your arms up towards the ceiling, if anything. But then otherwise, sometimes I just say, lift your arms or reach your arms. And I actually don't talk about what the shoulders are doing at all.
Yeah. Same here. I think I may not say much about the shoulders and shoulder blades when the arms are overhead. And I also feel like because if I say inner border down and outer border up, that's going to confuse most people, unless maybe it's a training setting and I'm teaching that rhythm of the shoulder blades. But what was I going to say? Oh, in like acrobatic world, like people who actually teach handstand, like they actually teach you to lift the shoulders up, like they really have to press the floor down and shoulders have to come up for that push to be able to get the handstand. And I feel like similarly in down dog, we really have to push the floor away.
Yeah. And two, when I do teach handstand, or even when I teach Urdhva Dhanurasana, upward bow, which the arms are in flexion, then you're pressing the ground away. Obviously, it's more complex than that. But this letting the shoulder blades widen across the upper back too, I feel like is important, because when your arms go up, your shoulder blades widen and lift. And in particular, sometimes with back bends, we think back bends are only squeezing the shoulder blades towards one another, drawing the shoulder blades in towards center. But yeah, you really need that push and that reach.
Yes.
And the shoulders have to lift.
Definitely. I guess if you're listening to this and this is the first time you're hearing this concept, maybe feel it in your body, like do down dog and see how it feels like to really push the floor down and let the shoulders lift towards your ears, and then do the opposite and just try to pull the shoulders away from your ears and just kind of see how it feels in your body. I would encourage that. And maybe I'll put some links on the show notes of like different articles or blogs or YouTube channels of other well-known teachers talking about this. So you don't have to trust our words for it, but it is a topic of discussion in the yoga world. And then is there anything else about the shoulder blades before I want to ask you questions about the hands placement?
I'm trying to think. Yeah. If people are wondering what they might be able to say, because you and I were talking about this, and I think, often we read these articles or listen to these podcasts and they're like, don't say this as a yoga teacher anymore. Well, the question is, what do I say instead? Well, one, you could say nothing, but at the same time, if you're teaching a class and you say nothing, that doesn't get you far as a teacher. I think if you were concerned about someone's upper traps being, way up into their neck, you might be able to say, like, right where the tops of your shoulders meet the base of your neck. See if you can find a little softness or a little space there. I mean, even for me, sometimes just if I'm going to use my hands, just sort of like tapping that area on someone can help. I mean, we could also go off on this tangent, which I feel like this could be a whole other conversation, but externally rotating the arms when they're overhead will actually, at least for me, in my experience, give you a little bit of that spaciousness, as opposed to pulling the shoulders down.
Yes. I definitely feel that when I externally rotate my arms, even like more than like little exaggerated external rotation, I can feel that upward rotation. So it's that the outer border of the shoulder blades kind of wrapping around my rib cage and lifting up.
Yes. Yeah.
With that more exaggerated upward movement from the outer shoulder blades. I know this is getting technical, but then I can start to feel the inner part, which is like the spot right next to your neck on the upper trapezius. That area can like kind of soften and release down towards my pelvis.
Yeah. And it's funny because obviously those of you that are listening to this can't see the video, but Reika and I are both reaching our arms overhead because we're like, wait. Because like so much of my cueing comes from an understanding of my own body or how things feel. But again, it's very personal. So that's the thing. A cue that works for me might not work for someone else. But I think when the arms are going overhead, I just don't think that we need to say anything about the shoulders going down anymore. I think we just can encourage people to lift the arms up and even let the shoulders lift the arms up.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. And yeah, I think anybody listening, like I said, just see it, try it, feel it in your body. And I think that'll make more sense in like more embodied experience in your body rather than just listening. So next question I have is hand placement and like where hands are placed, let's say down dog plank. And when you're doing chaturangas, should it always be shoulder width?
I mean, should anything always be?
Sometimes I notice for me, like I have tighter shoulders. So I prefer and feels better in my body to have my hands a little bit wider than shoulder width in my down dog. And for me, it even helps for me to turn my palms slightly more out, which helps my arms to find external rotation because I have hard finding that external rotation with tight shoulders. So that always felt good for me in my body when I do down dog.
Yeah, I think it's relative. And again, it's one of those things where we have to guide our students, right? We can't just say nothing. But I think about even just kind of starting with tabletop position, it can be a guide. A lot of the times I'll say hands relatively under your shoulders, knees relatively under your hips. instead of being like, your wrists must be directly under your shoulders, your knees must be directly under your hips. Because even just that little shift, and that's what I find so interesting about cueing in general, language as a means of not being so rigid or black and white, but as a means to kind of hold space for people to explore differences in their bodies. And actually, there was that teacher that you were telling me about that was talking about wheel. I can't remember his name.
I only know his Instagram name, but Yogi Matt. I think. Matt Giardino or something like that.
He just made a post, I think it was him, about how, and I was like, oh yeah, this is actually really smart. We can kind of teach to anatomy as opposed to teaching alignment. We can teach alignment informed by anatomy. Because I think everyone's anatomy is so different. So there isn't going to be a one size fits all for anyone's body.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes it fun as a yoga teacher, but also I think as a newer teacher who's currently in 200 hours or who just finished 200, I think it's difficult because I remember I just wanted to know what's right, what's wrong. What are the correct, quote unquote, correct alignment cues to say for each pose? Whereas like now we're kind of saying like, well, like
it depends,
which makes it a little bit more challenging for somebody who's learning to become teacher, who's newer and, are still learning to become a good teacher. But I think it's so fascinating to watch your students' body. So you can really see it with your eyes that not every person's going to do well with one specific alignment cues.
Yeah, and I think too, when I first started teaching, and I'm sure this is most people, I felt pretty rigid. It was like by the book. Whatever was in my 200-hour manual, that's what I was saying. And there was no variation from there. And I think the more that you teach, and again, the more that you see bodies, the more that you realize there is such a difference in so many things. And how can you speak in a way that still gives context for what you're doing, but again, hold space for people's differences. And it's nuanced, and it can be very challenging. Like in down dog, like you were saying, sometimes I'll just tell people, if you feel like your shoulders are a little bit tighter, you can take your hands wider, you can turn them out, see how that feels. I did, however, I think we talked about this, and I don't really know what happened because I was teaching 40 people, but I remember I had given that cue in a class, and sometimes you're not seeing everything that's happening when there's 40 people packed into a room. But I believe the student turned her hands out really wide. I don't really know because I didn't necessarily see, but her shoulder came out of its socket. Did I tell you this?
You told me about this, but I really didn't think it was your cue.
I know, but I was like, oh my gosh. Well, here's the thing. There could have been some type of shoulder instability, but it's just interesting because I'm seeing it from this lens of, people who are tight probably need to turn their hands out wider, right? And I think some people who have hypermobility or instability, they may perceive tightness in a way that's actually not tightness. So they can kind of go to their end range and then things can happen from there. So I was like, I never thought that cue could, and again, I don't, like you're saying, I don't think that it was exactly that cue, but it was a moment for me to be like, wow, I never thought that cue could lead to that. If that's what happened, I don't really know. But it was sort of an interesting moment for me to think about what I say when I teach.
Yeah. No, but knowing you, I know your cues are very intelligent. You think about every word you say. You're not just
too much, probably.
Words out there. And you try to offer variations as well as options, and you don't teach in a way that's rigid of this is alignment, it must be. But with that, I remember when you told me about this, but I could understand if somebody dislocated their shoulders in flip dog, wild thing, or side plank. That is a little bit more likely scenario, but I heard it was the beginning of the class, first down dog of the class. So, I think, I don't know, it could be something that was going on with her body, but yeah, I don't think it was that cue of maybe turning your hands out and making it wider. I don't know.
Yeah, I just do think it's interesting that your cues can land so differently. So with anything, we have an intentionality behind why we're saying what we're saying, but it doesn't necessarily translate to everyone.
Yeah, it's so true. And sometime, I think you and I both do this sometime. It's like, if I have time in class, I might teach like, try your hands a little bit closer and then try your hands a little further apart and now try it further apart and like choose the one that felt good in your body, and you're always welcome to always be changing and adjusting during the class or during your weeks of practice, a month or years or decades. Like, I think what feels right in our body is probably going to change as well over time. And even in one 60-minute class, it could change. So if I have time in class to kind of let them explore the placement of the hands or placement of their feet or the positioning of the pelvis or something like that, it's nice if we can give time for students to explore it and then let them choose which one felt right for them or which one felt good for their body.
Yeah, and I can't remember when this happened. I want to say maybe it was at a workshop at some point, but I'll move us on to our next point because sometimes you and I can just start going off on tangents. But I learned this from Alexander Crow, talking about what the elbows are doing in Chaturanga.
Yeah.
And the cue that we need to squeeze the elbows in or hug the elbows in or have the elbows next to the body when we're doing Chaturanga. But for some people, they have what's called a carrying angle. Most people have a little bit of a carrying angle. I can't remember the exact measurements. I want to say it's like 10 to 13% is normal, but essentially it's the angle from the upper arm to the forearm at the elbow. If you're standing with your arms down alongside your body and your palms facing forward. So even me right now, I'm just holding my arms down alongside. And I actually have a little bit of a carrying angle. But you would be shocked at the carrying angles that some people have that you just perhaps don't notice as a teacher. So the idea is that if someone, and I'm going to try to explain this. Sometimes when I ask my class, does that make sense? I'm asking them to make sure that I make sense, not that they're understanding me. I said that the other day. I was like, I'm not talking about you. I'm just making sure that I'm actually making sense. But the amount of carrying angle that you have when you're standing with your arms down and your palms facing forward is essentially going to determine the sort of same angle if you were to take that and sort of flip it forward so that your hands were under your shoulders when you were doing Chaturanga, right? If your hands are under your shoulders and you have more of a carrying angle, your elbows are actually going to be more out to the sides of your body and not hugged in. And if you were to actually hug your elbows, and it's interesting because I've seen someone with a large carrying angle do this because the hands are now fixed, right? The arm bones will actually go forwards in the shoulders, like pitch way forwards as a result of them trying to diminish this angle between their upper arm and their lower arm, which I never like to say any movement. I don't think any movement we do is inherently injurious. Injurious? What is that?
Is that a word?
Wait. I don't think any movement that we do is inherently going to cause us injury, right? But the question is like, of these repetitive movements, which ones maybe aren't the most ideal in particular at our joints? And I would say because the shoulder is such a shallow, the socket is so shallow and there's so much more movement in the shoulder that perhaps it is more injury prone. But I never want to speak that way because I don't like that. I don't like creating fear in people's bodies because I think all movement is good. But I think, with carrying angles, if we're always having the arm bones pitched way forwards and the shoulders like that, it's probably not going to feel great over time.
Yeah.
So they actually may need to let their elbows, and I know it's like, oh, they can move away from their body and they'll be okay. Yeah, it might feel better for them. And that's the thing. I remember a student, I was talking about carrying angles, and then I was like, let your elbows move away. And she cried. She cried because she felt like she could never do Chaturanga right. And it always felt bad in her shoulders when she squeezed her elbows in. And something as simple as giving someone permission. Obviously, they have that permission, but when they hear it from someone they're perceiving as like the leader of the class, and then it feels better, it's almost revolutionary. In their body. And I think that's an opportunity that we have as teachers to really help our students learn about themselves. And you and I always talk about this, but I love yoga because it helps me learn about myself.
Yes, that's what's so beautiful about, yoga, alignment, or anatomy. It's like we're so different. Every student in your class is going to be so different. And if we can help them find what feels aligned in their body, they don't have to follow this textbook cueing that we've been told. But a certain body type going to need slight different variation of those alignments. And yeah, if we can help them find that. And like you said, like they don't need our permission. As a teacher, we just have so much power to be able to make an impact, not only physically, but like what's going on mentally in their head too. I love that.
Yeah. And I want to circle back and say again, okay, so if we don't say squeeze your elbows in, what do we say then, right? Because again, I don't want to just leave these people with nothing. I think generally I'll say, well, if I'm cueing Chaturanga, I'll say think about the top of the head or the center of your chest lengthening forward so your spine is long, and keep the energy moving forward as you bend your elbows back, or let your elbows bend back. I think, like you said, I don't necessarily think hugging the elbows in is wrong. I don't think I would say squeeze them in towards the sides of the body, because it depends. If we're doing a class where we're workshopping Bakasana or crow pose, we may want to do a Chaturanga that's more biased in the triceps, so the elbows hugging in, but there's literally nothing wrong with letting your elbows go wide. You do wide arm push-ups. I would say maybe the elbows higher than the shoulders isn't like super ideal on the shoulder, but somewhere in line with the shoulders, somewhere between the shoulders and the ribs, I think is totally okay. You might just get a little bit more chest when the elbows go wider, but why not practice all of them?
Yeah. It's not like sometimes we feel like, elbows has to be right by our rib cage or squeezing by the rib cage to do Chaturanga, or else I don't know what. Because in the gym, people are doing push-up with elbows wide all the time, and that's it's just working different muscles. But it's not that one way is wrong or one way is worse than other.
And if someone was running up towards you and you wanted to push them away, would you push them with your elbows hugged in, or would your elbows be wide and would you use all your body weight and push them away?
Yes, I think I've heard Judith Lassiter use that examples. And she was like, we want to use the big chest muscles to push somebody away if somebody's coming at you, more than smaller tricep muscles. So it makes sense we have more power when elbows are out. That way.
And I definitely, everything that I'm saying, I feel like I've learned from another teacher. And I think, too, that's what's so important, at least for me, about continuing educating yourself, whether it's just, following teachers or talking with other teachers or looking things up or learning about anatomy. It doesn't have to be an expensive training, but we have such a resource of experienced people really at our fingertips with the internet. We're almost doing ourselves a disservice if we're not trying to sort of broaden our knowledge base as teachers and question things. I think that comes with when you teach over time. I think when you first teach, you're really rigid and you feel like is this only way. And part of it is because you're trying to be confident. You want people to know what you know. And I feel like I said the same exact thing in the first podcast that we were together, where the more I teach, the less I feel like.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why, like you said, I completely agree with you. We should, as a yoga teacher, continue to learn, because if you did your teacher training 10 years ago, 20 years ago, there's so much more information out there about how our body works and how the bones are and body mechanics. And there's just so much more knowledge out there. There's more research is out there. So most likely, if you did teacher training 10 years ago, there's like a gap if you haven't been learning and like evolving, learning new cues or new way of trying poses. It's always evolving. New knowledge is always coming, and it's challenging the old way of doing things. So I think it's so important to stay up to date and have this curiosity of wanting to learn more and kind of being flexible and open enough to be able to change maybe how you used to be doing this, how you used to do things for the past 5-10 years. I think obviously you don't want to just believe anything somebody tells you right away. I think you have to hear it, you have to feel it in your body, and really have to make decision yourself, like, this feels right to me and it makes sense to do it this way, versus somebody just told you, so you're just gonna blindly follow that person. But I think it's this constant inquiry.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Karen, for this week's podcast and the conversation about the shoulders and hands. Next week, we're going to come back and talk about another part of our body and just give you all, the listeners, a couple of examples of cues that we decided to step away from. So thank you all for listening this week, and speak to you next week. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's conversation I had with Karen. I hope you could tell that we could actually go on and on and on talking about topic like this. We love talking about topic like this, and we just have so much to share. It was hard for us to keep it under 30 minutes because we could keep going on and on. But I hope you enjoy this style of episode where it is a little bit more informational, but it's casual at the same time, and it's also anatomical. So I hope you learned something, or maybe this is something you already knew, but you enjoyed listening to us talk about it. I would love some feedback. So if you want to give me a feedback, questions, or comment, you can always comment on the podcast episode from wherever you're listening from, or you can write me. You can write me on Instagram at Reika Yoga, or you can message me through my website, which is www.reikayoga.com. And I would really appreciate it if you could leave me a review, a rating, a stars, subscribe, download, whatever you can do from whatever platform you're listening to this podcast from. But most importantly, what means the most is if you could share this episode, share this podcast with your community, to your friends, to your coworkers. That's the best way to share the podcast with others, and that's going to help me so much. So thank you so much for listening always. And I want to remind you about the workshop that I am teaching this coming Sunday, March 16th at 11 a.m. in-person workshop here local in Long Beach at a Alter Society, which is a local brewery located in downtown Long Beach. And Carlos and I'll be teaching yoga. Carlos will be playing live music and giving a beautiful sound bath in the workshop. And this workshop is to celebrate spring equinox. So let's come together as a community and celebrate spring equinox. If you purchase a ticket on the link that I share on the show notes, afterwards you get 20% off at the brewery. If you want to stay for lunch, brunch, coffee, tea, or beer, whatever you choose to enjoy after class, you get 20% off your bill. So I hope you could make it. Come say hi. I would love to celebrate spring equinox with you. Thank you so much for listening, and I will speak to you next week.